This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit.
What do you guys want to talk about?
Oh boy. Talk about draining the energy out of somebody. This weekend was all over the map in terms of ups and downs. A lot of ups, a lot of downs, and not a whole lot of inversions or sideways. We had some WWE content that left me on the edge of my seat. And by that, I mean I was left on the edge of my seat trying to prevent myself from falling asleep. And then there was AEW, which I like to try to compare it to hanging out with the nieces and nephews at parties. They're very energetic. But boy, do they do a number on you by the time everything's over. They provide some great times, some good laughs, some memorable moments. And by the end, you just keep thinking to yourself, I'm happy it's over. And peace can finally be restored after everybody goes home and it's quiet. Kind of like how it's quiet in the studio room right now. For anybody that can't hear the rain falling on the roof, that was a joke. Anyway, yes, peace, tranquility. It's kind of what it was like watching Collision and some of the Forbidden Door pay-per-view over the weekend. A lot of fun moments, but man, oh man, I was so relieved when it was over. My cranky old butt just can't keep up with the energy anymore. I'm ready to retire. And I'm only in my early 30s. So with that said, you know what you're in for this time. Big installment to the Five Starr Wrestling Report. For anybody watching that has not already seen the show, hi. I'm going to be the new edition of Tony Khan on the channel. No, I'm just kidding. Now, for anybody that is checking out the show for the first time, we are also on Rumble. We're here every Monday and Friday. And we are currently in the process of potential modification with the content we do on these shows. The AEW Collision is still a relatively new thing. It is also experimental on my end. It's not a foregone conclusion that I'm going to continue sticking to watch the show. But it does look a lot more promising than Dynamite is these days. And trust me, I've been looking for any excuse in the book so that I don't have to watch that show anymore. As of now, we're sticking the course with both. Because pain and punishment is what fuels this podcast. My pain and suffering with having to watch so much bad modern wrestling. That is what brings people joy and happiness. Also on the agenda for today, Retro Raw. Speaking of joy and happiness. Yeah, I don't get much of it with having to suffer through those shows. But it's all part of the Retro Review series, which is a big part of the FSWR podcast. As much as we like to vent about how bad modern wrestling is, classic wrestling goes through its ups and downs as well. Especially with Retro Raw. Going back and reliving a time when the WWF was all about cartoon entertainment. WCW was a blimp on the radar in terms of relevancy. ECW was still trying to find its footing to a mainstream audience, and I was just sort of along for the ride, watching whatever I could get my hands on, which at the time was mostly the WWF and WCW, and whatever old tapes my brothers had in the VHS library. And I know you're just clamoring to hear what I have to say about Retro Raw from this week in 1994, so since we already have a lot on the agenda, why don't we just go ahead and dive right into this calamity. Who's ready for Retro Raw? God, these shows are garbage. Absolute garbage. More garbage than Duke the Dumpster Drozy's gimmick. And I'm not just saying that because he was part of the opening VTR this week. I was actually trying to forget about that whole garbage can incident last week with Jerry Lawler, and they made sure to remind me of it less than 3 seconds into the program. Here's what I actually forgot about. That incident where Lawler hit Duke with the gimmick trash can, they actually caught flack for that. They got in trouble from the network. I had totally forgotten that was a thing in 1994. The infamous policy change they underwent, where the WWF had to back off with the violent content, basically eliminated the ability for them to do things like low blows or hitting each other over the head with furniture. Even in the case of Lawler using a gimmick trash can, that was still considered too edgy for television. Now, of course, we can laugh in hindsight because we know how things turn out in a few years. But this was a revelation that I had totally forgotten about. It never occurred to me last week. That whole thing where Gorilla Monsoon had to go on air in the middle of Monday Night Raw and basically apologize on behalf of Lawler, saying the company doesn't condone his actions or what he did to Duke the Dumpster. I just thought it was part of the show. Apparently there was a shoot element to that. And what better timing too, right? During the time when Vince was off television undergoing the hearings for the steroid scandal. Talk about bad timing. So that whole opening deal this week was kind of designed for Lawler to come on camera and do a half-hearted apology for attacking Duke. And the story was he had a great deal of difficulty saying the words, "I apologize." I don't think he ever actually uttered the words, but he insinuated that if the WWF needs to fine or suspend him for his actions, they can go right ahead. Because Lawler's got money, damn it. He can afford to take the hit. That was a good heel line. But yeah, let the record show the Jerry Lawler Duke the Dumpster Drozy angle from the King's Court segment in the summer of 1994. That had real-life company ramifications. And I had totally overlooked that it ever happened. Kind of like how I overlooked a lot of things that happened in the WWF during this period. Such as the opening match, for example. What had to have easily been Bam Bam Bigelow's worst career match. It's him versus King Mabel. No, soon to be King Mabel. About 1 year too early. I mean, he was dressed in the purple gear here, so it's kind of where my hindbrain went. So this match about sucked, with the exception of one person in this match that may have saved it all. Luna Vachon. She earned an Emmy for her work here. For the 3 or so minutes the match lasted, she made it all worthwhile. I mean, the match itself was rotten beyond all belief. Mabel was borderline immobile. I mean, he got blown up like a minute in. Bam Bam's just kind of out there going through the motions. And they eventually build to a spot where Luna is on the ring apron admonishing the fans, and the people are all chanting, "Luna! Luna!" And, well, the funny thing is, I'm watching this unfold in front of my eyes. I know what's coming. And still, when I actually saw it, I'm like, did they literally just do that? Sure enough, it happened. Okay, so Bam Bam brings Mabel over to the ropes, and he's setting him up for an Irish whip. And of course, Luna's standing at the polar opposite end of the ring apron, and I'm thinking to myself, there's no way. There's no way they're going to have this 600-pound fat ass bump Luna off the apron. He'll fucking kill her. Sure enough, Mabel gets Irish whipped. He runs toward the 115-pound Luna Vachon at the other end of the ring. And from the hard cam footage, all we see is Mabel slightly nudge Luna with his ass. Luna proceeds to then fly off the ring apron like she got shot out of a cannon. For all intents and purposes, she was killed. She supposedly hit the ring barricade, although we didn't actually see it. We just see her laying dead on the mat face first. It's presumed that Mabel bumped her into the barricade and killed her. Would not be all that shocking if that were the case. And of course, that was only the first part of Luna dying. There was a second part. Just to make sure they wrote her off for good. They also do a spot, probably about a minute or two later, where Bam Bam is out on the floor going to check on her. And all of a sudden, here comes Mabel for a double axe off the ring apron. He proceeds to come down on top of Bam Bam, who then comes down on Luna. And Luna hits the ring barricade a second time, head first. This time we actually see it in plain view. And that is when I write down in my notes, okay, it is official. She's dead. And after Mabel proceeds to slide back in the ring to beat the 10 count on Bam Bam, that's when they announce Mabel as the winner. And then him and Oscar sort of dance off. And then we see Luna back in the ring with Bam Bam. Perfectly fine. She's in there arguing with him, throwing a temper tantrum. What a trooper. I couldn't believe they didn't cart her off to the morgue after that spot. I watched that apron bump she took like 5 times in a row. They couldn't convince me that was a full work. The amount of weight colliding with her running at full speed, it was impossible to believe Luna took her own apron bump. That's a Raw moment if I've ever seen it. But, now Mabel was more or less inconsequential to the overall segment, because afterwards, they had Ted DiBiase come down to have a chit-chat with Bam Bam and Luna. This was part of that collaboration to bring them both on board as part of the $1 Million Corporation. At least I think it was. It wasn't entirely clear in this segment. We found out later on. They also used this as an opportunity to unveil Ted's big exploit. He'd been teasing it for weeks, but he finally lived up to his word. He's searched high and low, but he's finally found him. He's finally found the man he brought into the WWF at Survivor Series 1990. The Undertaker. He's back. And now he's aligned with Ted. But is he really the Undertaker? Perhaps we need to stick around for more to unfold because we're not getting the entire picture just yet. Looks like the Undertaker. It sounds like the Undertaker. Probably smells like the Undertaker, although I can't confirm that. But I am smelling a ruse. He wasn't moving like the Undertaker. I'm quite suspicious. And from that point, we went back to the ring for another boring squash. This time it's IRS versus Rich Myers. And here's pretty much everything you need to know about it. The WWF fans are tax cheats. IRS is a jerk. And he won with a crossface submission. Rotunda was also sweating like a pig after this was over. And the match only went like 2 minutes. It was... I think it was mostly just a plug for superstars that weekend because IRS was scheduled to wrestle Doink. Yeah, that's about where my interest level peaked. We did follow that with a great King's Court segment, though. Another installment of it, but this one was leaps and bounds better than last week. This one was all about the Hart family. Now, specifically, it was about Jim Neidhart's explanation for why he turned on Bret at King of the Ring. What happened that would cause him to turn his back on his former partner of the Hart Foundation? Well, the Anvil came down to explain it, to the best of his abilities, albeit Jim was never the greatest promo in the world, so he wasn't firing on all cylinders here. But the main gist to it was that from the day Bret and the Anvil started working together as a team, the Anvil was the one always carrying the workload. All those times Bret won championships throughout his career, it was all because of Jim's work and guidance. And when Bret finally became the WWF champion, did he ever thank Jim Neidhart once? No. Not one thank you. So when Jim showed up at King of the Ring to help Bret in his match with Diesel, the only thing he was doing was buying his time to make sure that Bret kept the belt. That way Owen would have a straight shot at the WWF title, considering he already has a win over Bret. Therefore, he can do it again. And speaking of the Handsome Devil, they introduced us to the King of Hearts. And here comes Owen, sporting the crown, the robe, and the walking stick. He's milking this gimmick for all it's worth. And, God, what a great fucking heel promo this was. Saying that he's finally getting the respect he deserves for all his hard work and dedication. And meanwhile, he finally has a family representative that he can trust. The only one he can trust, in fact. And it's Jim the Anvil Neidhart. Great moment here where he's talking about Bret. The fact that he beat, humiliated, and embarrassed him at WrestleMania 10. And without missing a beat, Gorilla Monsoon on commentary, point blank, just goes, "Liar." I laughed. And for the record, Owen did beat Bret at Mania. So I don't really know what Gorilla was getting at here. The humiliation part, we can certainly debate that, but a win's a win. Gorilla was so great firing back at Owen here. He's out there talking about how he ran through all the competition and proved he was the best in the King of the Ring tournament. And Gorilla once again just goes, "You cheated!" Again, I laughed. And while Owen's out there raking Bret over the coals, talking about the fact that for his entire childhood, Bret did nothing but overshadow Owen. Never stood up for him, never gave him a fair shot. And now that Owen's proved he's on Bret's level, he only needs one shot. One chance to become WWF champion. If Bret's got the guts enough to accept the challenge. This was hands down the best part of the show. Owen was on fire here. The Anvil was good. Lawler's Lawler. We know that guy can get heat just by smiling and glaring at the camera. And again, it's a clear shot. You see what they're setting up for SummerSlam. A very simple, easy to follow storyline. It's like, I don't know, it's honestly on par with where I was with watching Dynamite like a year and a half ago. On the show you had MJF and CM Punk feuding in what was probably the greatest storyline they've ever done in company history. And then there was all the other garbage surrounding it that just made your eyes bleed. That's basically what WWF Raw right now is in the summer of '94. The Owen Brett feud is the MJF Punk story, and everything else is everything else, basically. Because we come out of that, and then we go right into a Head Shrinkers versus Executioners match. A squash match where Gorilla and Savage were spending more time joking about which version of the Executioners we were seeing. Savage, I believe, said it was Executioner number 99 and 44. Pee-hee. I mean, if you enjoy watching big, strong dudes beat up smaller job guys, sure, it was fun. Maybe not for 5 minutes, which is how long this went. It just kept going and going and going and going and going and going. Meanwhile, the announcers got so bored making jokes about the jobbers, they then had to start making ongoing jokes about feuds that had nothing to do with this match. And after multiple instances of the Head Shrinkers pulling the job guys off the mat before 3 counts, the finish was them winning with the assisted Superfly Splash. For the record, during this match, Gorilla said that there was an ongoing altercation happening in the locker room between Luger and Crush. Never found out what it led to. Luger was out there to wrestle a bit later on, but yeah, it would appear that backstage angle was a mirage. I wish the following match was a mirage. Good God, I forgot this gimmick was still a thing. Quang. Yeah, that goofy gimmick is still a thing. Can't even say it with a straight face. Quang. Just total Vince gimmick. Anyway, he won a quick squash with Mike Moraldo. The announcers are more interested in the drop-in announcements. And in fact, Gorilla actively told Randy Savage, fuck the match, do the TV plugs. Can't make it up, folks. I'm actually trying to remember how long this Quang gimmick continues for. I mean, I know it wasn't around that long, but the fact that it's still on the show, it's just like kind of mind-blowing. But then again, the Savio Bodyguard debut doesn't happen for like another year or two. I mean, I could probably look it up on Wikipedia if I cared, but that would actually take a concerted effort to open up a Google tab to type in KWANG. I mean, I could probably get through the rest of this Raw report in quicker time. The main event was Lex Luger versus Alexander Graham Bell, or whatever the guy's name was, I don't care. It was every Lex Luger squash you've ever seen. There was a momentary period where they filmed Ted DiBiase looking on through the entrance tunnel. And, they tried to make it all ominous with the eerie yellow lighting and the fog machine. Basically the story is the announcers trying to determine whether or not Luger has signed a deal with DiBiase as part of his faction. Right now, it's all speculation. The Luger-Crush feud, still getting mentions, even though we didn't get one on-screen appearance from Crush at all this week. Actually, now that I think about it, wasn't this around the time that Crush got let go from the company for a period of time? I know he had a fallout with Vince and he ends up abruptly leaving the WWF later this year, but I thought that was way later on. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Crush had already gotten let go by this point. I'm not sure. In any case, on the topic of DiBiase, he sort of rounded things out by going over everybody that was currently part of the $1 Million Enterprises or corporation, whatever the group was called. We obviously know about Nikolai Volkov. He was sort of handcuffed into that agreement. Bam Bam Bigelow has now joined forces with Ted. The Undertaker is now officially in the group. And now we're waiting for the official announcement of Luger being added. This was certainly a wild, oddball storyline they had going on. I don't remember a whole lot about the DiBiase faction, excluding some of the stuff with the Undertaker story. Mostly because that was all infamously bad. But, yeah, it's weird. Like, the $1 Million Corporation faction, I remember it was a thing. Like, it started to bring back some memories. I kind of remember it ends up turning into one of those, like, NWO deals where, they just keep adding members, and by the time it's over, there are like 80 different people in the group. I don't know. And how many people were even in the faction by the end of it? Wasn't it like 15? It went on for a long time, too. It's like right up until DiBiase's departure, if I'm right. He jumped ship to WCW. What year was that? Was that summer of 96? Yeah, this is just the beginning stages, man. And if you're thinking to yourself, a lot of it doesn't make sense right now, just you wait. It does not get any more coherent from here. Much like a lot of WWF's booking. But I'll just go ahead and spare you that horror and misery for another time. Let's, now, speaking of horror, nightmare, and misery, let's quickly talk about this disaster of a SmackDown show that took place over the weekend, where the only positive takeaway on the entire program was the opening 5-minute VTR of the Usos super kick of death to Roman. The series of super kick shots heard around the globe. I believe it was 2 shots to Solo and 2 shots to Roman. And it's funny, too, because I wrote something down in my notes as a joke last week and totally forgot to bring it up on the show. More of my concerted efforts to piss off all the Beta Bucks fans in the world. I think it was something like, the super kicks that got over more than any super kick Matt or Nick Jackson have ever done in their entire careers combined. And if you think I'm lying, we can do a compare and contrast analysis with the crowd reactions, and I'm not entirely off base. And those crybaby pansies with their measly super kicks, they wish they could get that kind of ovation. Keep dreaming. So anyway, yeah. The opening VTR, aka the segment that aired last week, and they were just refreshing our memories as to what happened. The penultimate lead up to the blow-off of the bloodline, for all intents and purposes. And, well, now we're here. A week later. It's been done. So what now? Well, we're still trying to figure out answers. And all the while, there's about 90 minutes worth of other stuff happening on this show right now. Most of which is either painfully boring or painfully bad. Before we sort of dive into that rabbit hole, let's talk about some of the follow-up of the Bloodline story, since it is the only thing on the show that's worth giving a damn about. Here come the Usos, and as they're walking down to the ring, that's when they throw up the graphic on screen to advertise the Bloodline Civil War match. Add Money in the Bank. It will be Solo and Roman versus the Usos. A match that probably could have been a major money grab for SummerSlam if they were trying to sell some last-minute tickets. I'm not entirely sure how ticket sales were already doing for that show, but hey, if you needed a hook, that would have been the match to fill the seats. But instead, we're getting it at one of the filler specials before the Big Four pay-per-view. All right. Not the end of the world, I guess. It is a very intriguing match on paper in the sense that, I mean, honestly, I haven't put a whole lot of forethought into the idea of which team ought to go over in that match. On the one hand, I mean, you sort of have to validate the Usos' face turn. But then again, what do the Usos really gain out of the win? I mean, I don't really see it as a case where Jimmy or Jay would break away to pursue singles gold. I mean, and even if they did, they're not having Jimmy or Jay become the Universal Champion. I know that one's been floated around as a possibility. I just think there are way too many outstanding roadblocks that would get in the way of that. Mainly when it comes to marketability. Like, when you're toying with the idea of deciding to run with a set of identical twins as your top world champion, I mean, then your issue is, okay, well, you split them up as a team. So what do you do with the other one? That's why I'd be hesitant to go in with that booking decision. Let's also not omit the talking point, and I know this is like ancient history now that the archaeologists would have to go out of their way to dig up. The DUI story with Jay wasn't all that long ago. Remember when he was in some hot water with the company a couple years back when he got busted for, what was it, something like his third DUI charge within the span of like a 2 or 3 year time frame? I mean, I don't have the articles open in front of me right now, but I remember talking about that on the channel before. It actually kind of brought to light the reality of where we are now with the Usos getting all this screen time. And you almost forget, one of these guys was in deep with law enforcement not all that long ago. So they got a real interesting scenario right now. It's like, okay, we're getting the tag match. That's not all that shocking, but who goes over? It's another discussion entirely. As far as their promo goes, I honestly didn't write a whole lot down. To be blunt, it wasn't particularly good. Jay kind of seemed nervous and lost for a lot of it. Like he was stammering over himself, repeating a lot of previous phrases. I mean, they said what they needed to in order to get the point across and sell the match, but the one thing I haven't really talked about all that much is the issue with the long-winded Usos promos. Jimmy, I would say, sounds a little more natural on the microphone. Like, he was actually a good counterbalance to Jay here. But this was one of those promos where I spent more time kind of looking at the clock waiting for it to end than I was actually invested in the material. I don't know. I mean, all in all, they love Roman, but he disrespected them, and they're not going to take that sitting down. Probably the most important part of the promo was when they started talking about Paul Heyman. They can always forgive brotherhood, but ever since the bloodline was founded, Heyman's been that outsider manipulating decisions and causing havoc. Then they basically called him a snake. And that all tied in with some of the conversations that Jay and Paul E were having in those pre-tapes over the last couple weeks. Jay always kind of saw through the BS, as did Jimmy. Roman and Solo are the ones still drinking the Kool-Aid. So it is kind of a cool little caveat there lingering over the group right now. Paul E's influence over everything. So I'm interested to see how he plays into the mix in Money in the Bank. Maybe he ends up being the difference maker and everything. How do you factor him into the finish? I don't know, but leaves you wondering. All in all, the segment was fine for what it was designed to do. The Usos just aren't the best promos in the world, so it started to flounder a little bit the longer it went. From there, though, well, we started to trickle off a little bit here with the quality of the programming. Didn't hit a brick wall yet, although we were rapidly approaching it. We had a Rey Mysterio LA Knight match that was decent. Y'all know I'm a big proponent of LA Knight. Yeah.
Yeah! Yeah! I said pipe down, I'm talking!
His booking is another story entirely, but the actual talent, probably one of the more underrated, underappreciated wrestlers in the entire company right now. With that said, this is probably not his best showing in the ring. I think I've reviewed a couple matches with him and Ray before. this doesn't sound like a new match. For whatever reason, this one just wasn't really firing on all cylinders. Lots of weird, sloppy spots where it kind of looked like they weren't entirely on the same page with communication. I mean, they covered their tracks as best they could, but, especially when they were building up to that finish, they just seemed like they were totally on different pages. LA Knight winning was basically a foregone conclusion. You had to put the guy over. Going over basically clean with a blunt force trauma. I could ask questions like, okay, so then why in the fuck did they job out LA Knight to Escobar the previous week? Just to turn around and give him a win back on TV to Ray a week later? I don't know. Beats the hell out of me. That's WWE logic for you. It's what they call 50-50 booking. But, of course, LA Knight had the win here. He's one of, what is it now, like 7 guys that are going to be in that Money in the Bank ladder match next weekend? Oh, fuck, I forgot that show's coming up too. Now, apparently, with the addition of Logan Paul, which, kind of changes the dynamic a little bit. I was totally sold on Knight winning the briefcase, but now that I'm looking at the Logan Paul insertion, man, I'm thinking of some big money opportunities they could get with Logan as Mr. Money in the Bank. For starters, a feud with him and LA Knight, that could be dynamite. And Logan Paul, it's been a while since we've seen him on the show, but was he a babyface last time he was around? Who did he wrestle in Mania this year? It was Seth, right? I'm pretty sure Seth was a heel. Fuck if I know. I have no idea what Seth's gimmick is. But I'd love to see him mix it up with Knight. That could be a big SummerSlam match. Be their chance to sort of redeem LA Knight's booking and give him a big featured match on a Big Four show. But, on the other hand, man, you want to talk about the ultimate swerve that would perfectly facilitate an LA Knight face turn. People want to cheer him. They want to love him. I'm thinking if they played their hand right, you can milk a major heat reaction to Money in the Bank by having Logan fuck over Knight and steal the briefcase from him. I mean, we all know WWE loves those photo finish angles in matches where it looks like the babyface is about to pull off the miracle of a lifetime, only for the heel to come in and swoop it out from under their nose. LA Knight and Logan Paul, those are the perfect 2 guys to do it with. Especially if we're going to go full-fledged babyface LA Knight and full-fledged heel Logan Paul for SummerSlam. Just throwing the option on the table. You don't have to take it. But they should consider me as a booking agent. Because I could throw my 2 cents into those creative meetings and make them a lot of money. I really could. Not to toot my own horn. So, well, continuing onward, the downpour started to take off right around this point. There was a quick angle they shot to set up the main event. Solo attacked Ridge Holland with a spike, which prompted Sheamus to come out and challenge him to a fight later on. I mean, whatever. Kind of odd to think that Ridge conveniently bumped into Solo in a random backstage segment where the cameras were happening to film him. I don't really know what provoked Solo to attack Ridge. I guess he just doesn't like foreign people. That was more or less inoffensive television, compared to the next match, which was highly offensive television. In a completely random title unification match for belts that nobody gives a crap about, Shayna and Ronda defended the main roster girls tag belts against Alpha Fire and Ishmael Dawn, I believe, for the developmental girls tag titles. And I wish I were making that up. But yes, you heard me right. They actually had a set of developmental girls tag belts. Keyword used to. Not anymore. Perhaps for the better. Belts that were right on point of relevancy with the European title and the WWF Hardcore title once upon a time. Think of like every meaningless underneath belt WWE's had in their entire existence as a company. All of them combined were probably still more significant than the women's developmental tag team titles. Never even heard of such a stupid thing. I don't think those belts ever existed for the longest time as I was watching NXT. Somehow they came up within the span of the last year or so, and they got rid of them. Gee, I wonder why. So I really can't even complain about the title unification idea. Did anybody care about it? That's another conversation entirely. Highly doubt it. But Alpha Fire and Ishmael Dawn sure carried the belts like they were worth a damn. I will give them credit. They really wanted you to think those belts mattered. So I watched the match. Partially because I don't think I've seen a Fire and Dawn match yet. I know they've been on the main roster for a while. I think I've seen them do a promo or two, but haven't really kept tabs on their matches per se. As expected, they're pretty horrible. Alpha Fire is mediocre in the ring. I mean, she can at least do some basics. Ishmael Dawn just looks like she's either wrestling in slow motion or underwater. Either or. This was one of those matches where a bunch of green girls said, let's try to do a bunch of overly convoluted shit and see what the hell happens. And it looked like it. The spot before their commercial pitch was oddly humorous. Beyond the fact that the whole thing was overly telegraphed, I will say this. One of my newest pet peeves in wrestling these days are the spots where the wrestlers are perched to do a high spot, and like, because they know that somebody is supposed to cut them off, instead of it looking natural and spontaneous, instead the wrestlers have to look over their shoulder in the general direction of whoever's coming at them to cut them off. Am I the only one that notices this? Okay, in this case, Ishmael is on the top rope while Alpha is holding Ronda up in the electric chair. And because Shayna is supposed to run in and shove Ishmael off the top rope, what does Ishmael do? Well, she turns to look at Shayna in order to make sure that she knew she was coming. Which makes you then wonder, why couldn't Ishmael just stop Shayna? She saw that she was charging at her. Why didn't she just shove Shayna away? Well, the answer is because wrestling is stupid and the agents suck. And to make matters even dumber, Alpha then followed that by giving Ronda that dumbass fucking Poison Rana spot. Hate that move. Fucking garbage. If I were in charge, I'd be fining anybody that even mentions that move by name. Let me just say this. If I were the Bill Watts of WWE, if somebody came to me and said, all right, Tommy, I got an idea for a spot in a match. I'm going to use the Poison Rana. The first thing I would say is, all right, man, sure thing. And you can leave half your pay sitting on my office desk after the match for even suggesting such a stupid idea. It was around that point when Ishmael was making the comeback in this match where I realized, oh, okay, I guess Ronda and Shayna are heel. Never really put that together during the earlier stages. I mean, both teams were kind of unlikable. Ronda and Shayna were working like heels, but Alpha and Ishmael kind of had those radical, screechy feminist looks with the weird color hair and the piercings and the wild attitudes. So I just kind of assumed they were all heel, because those kinds of women are usually the most unlikable kinds of people on the planet. Didn't matter at the end of the day, because Ronda and Shayna won with double choke submissions. So I guess if you care, Shayna and Ronda are now the undisputed women's tag team champions of WWE. Slow clap. And then after the match, Raquel Gomez Sanchez Dominguez IV basically issued an open challenge to Ronda and Shayna, which of course then saw the TV return of Liv Morgan. And that's when I hit the fast forward remote. So if you're about it, that'll be a mouth-watering, stimulating title match to look forward to, probably at Money in the Bank. I think that'll be my designated piss break. Or it'll be my designated nightly skincare routine segment. Haven't quite made up my mind yet. I'll tell you what I made my mind up on rather quickly, though, was this next segment. Here are the following words I wrote down. Grayson Waller experience, pretty deadly, hell fucking no. That is all. I can't. I just can't. I don't like using that phrase, but pretty deadly are the pure definition of I can't. There are no possible scenarios to where I could sit through a Grayson Waller experience featuring Pretty Deadly and come out a better man. Like every time I see these guys on TV, my testosterone levels just immediately take a dip. I have to go pump iron at the gym to regain my strength. I feel the estrogen overwhelm me with their fucking weird-ass crop tops and whatever in the hell his gimmick is. I still don't know. It's like a cross between Adrian Adonis and Dolph Ziggler. And at least Adrian looked like he could believably kick somebody's ass once upon a time. All right, all joking aside, let me ask a genuine question, because apparently there are people out there that say these guys are really good. Okay, but even if you just remove that from the conversation, who is the audience for this team? I mean, some people say they're good wrestlers. From the couple matches I've seen of them, I don't get it. They're fine. Certainly not a duo that I need to go out of my way to watch. Not in those outfits. But, sorry, I just can't take it seriously. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm just that cynical, but I don't get it. So I did some heavy fast forwarding through this, as well as the following match with them and the Street Profits. And unfortunately, this is starting to fall into a pattern where, because they're actually going over in matches pretty consistently, this is probably going to be a common thread on like every SmackDown show going forward. Despite the absurdity of the gimmick, they're going to keep winning matches because somebody in the back is tickled by the act. Whether that's Hunter, whether that's Sean, whether that's Vince, I don't know. I can tell you though, for sure, doesn't tickle me. And they're getting a title match at the pay-per-view, aren't they? Yeah, it's them versus Sammy and Owens. Oh my God. I hope to Christ in heaven they don't put the belts on them. But they probably will. They probably will. Let's move on. Speaking of wrestlers that aren't over with me and make me want to reach for the remote as quickly as possible, Charlotte had a match with Lacey Evans' bulbous bosoms. And I know it's not polite to look, but I mean, come the fuck on. They were right there. A blind dude could see those things popping out throughout the whole match. Some people call it a wardrobe malfunction. Horny men call it a gift from God. Anyway, this was mostly short and pointless. just a way to give Charlotte a TV win because she's getting the title shot with Asuka and Money in the Bank. And of course, the idea is that she's supposed to go into that match as the babyface. So here with Lacey, she does every heel move in the book, including the cocky poses. She's like the female Jimmy Valiant of WWE without the charisma or the promo ability or the fan reception. Come to think of it, who am I kidding? She's nothing like Jimmy Valiant. She just fucking sucks at her job. Charlotte went over with the figure four bridge, and then Asuka immediately jumped her afterwards and got a babyface reaction because, you know, Charlotte's a horrible babyface. And as this miserable SmackDown experience draws to a close, well, before I talk about the main event, first I have to talk about this pre-tape in the back with Adam Pearce and Bianca Belair, where Adam essentially barred her from ringside. Because you'll recall, she did that promo last week where she basically insinuated that she was going to be hanging out at ringside for the Charlotte-Asuka title match. And naturally, Adam caught wind of that. So he put the kibosh on it. And Bianca was not happy. So I think everybody can figure out what's going to happen there. I did note this as a sidebar, just so nobody gets the impression that I hate women or anything. Bianca Belair. Very attractive woman. It's nice to see when you actually get women on the show with normal hair color and no tattoos and no piercings and actually dress and act like women. It's oddly refreshing. It's sad that I even have to bring something like that up, but I mean, if you ever go out into public spaces and look at your surroundings, you'll appreciate that comment a lot more, especially the young men out there. I won't even go into the weight thing. So the main event, Sheamus versus Solo. I don't know. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it's because I'm naturally inclined to only give a shit about the finish of most of these matches anymore. I nearly fell asleep watching this. It was fine. But like I said, we're all basically trained as fans to only really care about what happens in the last few minutes of these matches anyway. It's hard to really care about the stuff that precedes it. You know, once I started building to the false finishes here, that's when the crowd started coming more alive. I mean, they worked hard. Sort of your modern big man match where a lot of it was built around power moves. You know, Sheamus has his essential go-to moves that usually get a reaction. The apron clubs to the chest, the white noise, the bro kicks. He actually deadlifted Solo at one point for a Celtic Cross, which is basically his version of the Razor's Edge. That was really impressive. Solo is not a small guy. So seeing Sheamus pick him up like that, that was really cool. Especially way later on in the match when he was kind of blown up. But they end up building to a spot where Solo gives Sheamus the Uranagi on the announcer's desk. I don't know if that was intended for him to break the table or not, but he didn't. And then a few seconds later, Solo gives Sheamus the running hip attack through the barricade, at which point Jessica Carter, the official, waves the match off. And I don't know if there was ever an official rolling of the announcement, but I assume Solo won via ref stoppage. I mean, they very quickly glossed over it. And I did think it was kind of amusing. The amount of times we've seen guys take bumps through the barricades on this show in the last 3 or 4 months alone. Like, how many times have we seen Roman spear guys through barricades? Or see Brock spear guys through barricades? Like, so many occurrences of this. And they do it for a finish here. And somehow, in this particular instance, this was the one where the ref had to wave the match off. Whatever. The ending to the show was at least good. The Usos coming down to give Solo a receipt for trying to attack Sheamus after the bell. And it was kind of funny, too, because with the way they set this up, Solo really did not have a reason to get into the ring to confront the Usos. All he had to do was walk around ringside with Paul. But instead, he tried to meet Jimmy and Jay head on, and he ate a series of super kicks as a result. So he's laying flat on his back while the crowd's all going nuts for it. It was a decent finish. And I think Roman's going to be back next week to respond to all this, so I'm banking on some heat angles for the go-home edition. Call me a fortune teller, but I'm thinking that Uso Superkick party might come to a drastic halt next Friday night. We'll see, though. Albeit, most of the show is just a placeholder for... I guess they're in London next week for SmackDown, right? I know the pay-per-view's in London, but I'm pretty sure the SmackDown Go-Home show would also be at the same venue. That's what they did for the Saudi Arabia show, right? Was the show as horrible as I was making it out to be? No, probably not. I mean, it was still not really good, but you know me, I always like to exaggerate sometimes just to keep the people hooked for longer periods. Because you know the rants are what draws. I don't know, looking back, this was more of a stuff happened episode of SmackDown. Like, the Bloodline took a drastic backseat. Aside from that, the rest of the show didn't really have a whole lot going on. Outside the random girls' unification title match. I mean, that's your main selling point for a TV episode. Kind of lets you know it's a pretty skippable one overall, doesn't it? Alright, so now we're going to turn things over to the Collision Show. Episode 2 in the vault. And, no, actually, hold on. I had a bit planned for this segment, so I want to make sure we capture the moment. Just grab my sheet over here. You hear that? Those are my printed notes for the first hour of this show. This one took me through a roller coaster ride of emotions. For about the first hour, I was ready to completely dismiss this show and chalk it up to another case of Tony Khan refusing to take the passenger seat. Honestly, it's almost like this show was split entirely into two acts. We had Act 1, which had Tony's dirty fingerprints all over it. Hint, most of it wasn't good. And then we had Act 2, while still not perfect in execution, looked more like the pro wrestling show that Punk talked about in his promo last week. And I still don't entirely know how to even grade the show as a whole. If we were splitting everything into both hours, Hour 2, I'd give a solid A-. And Hour 1, F+. And I should have figured things were looking pretty bleak for this one right at the top of the program. 7 days ago, we get the return of CM Punk, and what probably will amount to being AEW's promo of the year, not to mention that great six-man tag with FTR, Joe, Juicy Fruit, and Jay White that tore the house down. 1 week later, we get a Chris Jericho segment in the opener. Guess we knew it was only a matter of time before that black hole of suck came in and tried to latch himself onto AEW's newest project. And Jericho saw the success of the Collision pilot and said, "I want in on that shit, brother." Despite the fact that at no point prior to the launch was Jericho ever promoted or advertised for AEW Collision, Most of us, I think, were just kind of expecting him to stay on the Wednesday program so he can shoehorn all of his bad ideas onto that show. We wouldn't have to put up with him on the Saturday programming. It was wishful thinking. And then I forgot who's really running the ship in all this. And you had to know that Tony was going to be too spineless to put his foot down and say, no, Chris, we're keeping all your sports entertainment garbage on Dynamite so we can let the pros handle business on Collision as we promised. So yeah. Remember when Punk said in his promo, "Tell me when I'm telling lies"? From this point forward, AEW Collision is going to be the pro wrestling show. Well, they shot that statement into the ground less than a week later. Now, of course, this whole segment was arranged around the big reveal of who Sting and Darby's third partner were going to be for the six-man at Forbidden Door. At this stage in the game, I don't think I really need to milk or build up to it since I'm already 48 hours late to the party with the review. Yes, it was Tetsuya Naito. And much like every New Japan appearance we've seen on AEW television in the last 12 months, you've basically got two schools of thought when it comes to fans. The New Japan marks that go, "Oh my god, that's Tetsuya Naito!" And then you have the regular casual fans that go, "Who?" And obviously I know who Naito is, because I've seen his work in New Japan for years now. But again, for any casual disenfranchised fans that may have tuned into last week's program, the ones that have been burnt out on the lame Duck Wednesday programs and are sick of seeing all the indie darling favorites getting rammed down their throats every week, how do you think this segment fared? Again, I want you all to remember this. For the people out there that are actually trying to look at this AEW Collision program as a second chance for this company to do right with the subjugated audience, the punk audience, for lack of better terms, the ones that actually want to see pro wrestling done correctly, do you think that those fans, A, want to see Chris Jericho on this show, and B, gave two flying fucks about that Forbidden Door pay-per-view? This is the same Collision show that 1 week ago had CM Punk open up things with a great in-ring promo by trying to set the stage for what AEW Collision is going to be. For all you frustrated AEW fans out there that are sick of all the garbage with the Elite, sick of watching a bunch of no-name indie guys get forced on the program like they're God's gift to the wrestling world, sick of all the outsiders coming in and sucking up airtime, most of whom are never going to be seen again after that stupid Forbidden Door pay-per-view anyway, and you actually want to see some guys with star power, you actually want to see some guys with drawing ability and potential, watch the Saturday shows. The people that are going to be mainstays on Collision. The guys that we thought were going to be the backbone of the program. The Punks, the FTRs, the Ricky Starks, the soon-to-be MJFs of the world. Possibly the Miros, or the Samoa Joes, or the Powerhouse Hobbs. If they can ever get off with the right footing with those guys again. Those are the names we want to see every week on Collision. In featured capacities. You know the names I don't want to see? The ones that leave a bad taste in my mouth because all it does is remind me of the horrible shit that I'm accustomed to seeing on Dynamite every Wednesday. And you know who's at the forefront of that conversation, aside from the BCC and the Elite? Chris Jericho. I understand they had a pay-per-view to sell the next night, but you know what? Objectively speaking here, that's what the Friday show is for. This segment did not belong on Collision. For the kind of audience this program is supposed to be marketed to, no one in that audience gave one fuck about Tetsuya Naito, Darby Allin, and Sting versus Chris Jericho, Minoru Suzuki, and Sammy Guevara. Nobody. This segment belonged on Rampage. And it's not even like the presentation or layout of this was any different from what we'd already come to expect on Dynamite. It was the usual bad attempts at comedy from Jericho. Tony Schiavone, as usual, being shoehorned in there for literally no reason. They took like 8 months to actually do the reveal of Naito. And then Naito took another 6 months to actually get down to the ring. I mean, at least he came dressed like a star. And he wasn't wearing a fucking t-shirt and jeans like everybody else has been wearing when they show up. Looking like bums that just bought their clothes at the local Walmart. I mean, Naito at least had some ring gear to give off the impression that he looked like a star. Or that he gave a shit to be there. But of course, then he actually gets in the ring and... well, nothing happens. He confronts Jericho. They whisper something to each other, probably in broken English, since Naito probably doesn't speak much of it. And then Jericho just leaves with Suzuki. They never come to blows. We don't get any real clarification on who Naito is, why he's there, the history between him and Jericho, or why we should honestly give a fuck about him being the third partner, beyond him and Jericho have beef. Why? Okay, so they had a match in the Tokyo Dome like 4 years ago. So what? Who gives a fuck? Why does it matter? Show us or explain to us why seeing Naito and Jericho face off again is such a huge deal. It's all the same shit that I constantly complain they get wrong on the Dynamite programs. Appealing to the lowest common denominator of fans and then wondering why their ratings are in the fucking toilet. And no one cares about anything that happens on that show. You want to know why you're always going to have a hard time keeping viewers or even garnering new eyeballs to the product? Generating intrigue? What do you expect when you do shit like this? The whole story reveal is Naito is the third partner and him and Jericho have history. And I guess we're left to connect the dots our fucking selves because, well, we don't have lives, clearly. We spend every waking moment of our lives on the internet browsing New Japan matches in our time off like a bunch of basement-dwelling mole rats. Retards. And then they wonder why people like me get pissed off and fast forward through 90% of the crap that happens on this show every week. So we were already about 11 minutes into this thing. I was already in a somewhat foul mood. No mention of Punk, by the way. In fact, Punk was not seen until hour 2, right before the main event. The biggest attraction they have on this show right now, and he was completely absent from the TV show until well into the second hour. But we needed 11 minutes of Chris Jericho jacking himself off on camera and sucking the life out of the room. Setting up a pay-per-view match and no one will remember a month after it happens. And then we go from that to a Miro promo. Apparently from somewhere in the bowels of the building. Honestly, I don't even know where the fuck this was filmed. Looked like he was in a sauna. There's a weird red light in the background. You basically only got the silhouette of Miro's face. And, well, I think his point here was that God pissed him off for keeping him locked in purgatory for the better half of the last year. So now he's chosen to go the pantheism route, where now he is his own higher power. I think that's correct, if my religious expertise is up to snuff. Isn't that pantheism? Or is that just a self-diagnosis of NPD? Oh, in any case, you know what we could have used on this show instead of an 11-minute Chris Jericho fap-off promo? Miro beating another guy in 2 minutes. That would have been nice. But we didn't get that. Instead, we got this next match. Swerve Strickland versus Hiroshi Tanahashi. And whereas Jericho spent 11 minutes or whatever doing bad comedy in his promo and pandering to the crowd with cheap heat shots, Tanahashi and Strickland decided to beat their dicks off here by doing an air guitar comedy spot. At which point I reverted back to Punk's comment about how this is going to be the professional wrestling product. And I said, well, that was a blatant lie. So I said, fuck this match. I'm skipping to the finish. If they're not going to take this seriously and work like professionals, I'm not going to indulge in their goofy jerk-off session. I mean, the match was already pointless to begin with. Why was this even booked? Is Tanahashi somebody we're going to be seeing regularly on the show? Is he someone they really ought to be putting over a guy they've been using on the TV shows regularly? Probably not. So why is a New Japan guy getting a clean win over an established AEW talent when we're probably never going to see the motherfucker back in the company for another year? The answer is because Tony Khan is still booking the show and he refuses to acknowledge that he has no clue what he's doing. And we're seeing the consequences for it. Oh, and by the way, this did not give me high hopes for the MJF Tanahashi match the next night. I'll cover that in a bit. On the topic of Tony having no idea what he's doing, I think I jumped the gun in trying to hold out hope that they were ever going to turn this House of Dreck shit around. Nope, it still sucks. As did this match with Andrade and Brody King. For every good thing I might have said about that match he had last week with Buddy Matthews, this one was the polar opposite. I mean, on the one hand, I guess I'm a little biased because I've been pretty outspoken about how much I hate this House of Dreck garbage. But I was at least willing to overlook some of that last week because of how good that match was with Andrade and Buddy. I don't know what the hell happened here, but this just came off like every mediocre indie match I've seen on Dynamite in the last 3 years. It started 100 miles an hour from the opening bell. It's a back and forth hodgepodge of spots early on. Lots of rope running and head palm shoot-offs, which is a classic AEW spot that we see virtually every match, where you grab the guy by the back of his neck and lightly pass him off to the ropes, where he then proceeds to take off full speed like you've been shot out of a cannon. I mean, Nigel kind of let the cat out of the bag here with one of his comments early on. It was during the spot where Andrade went up to the top turnbuckle to give Brody the blind moonsault out to the floor. Nigel just casually goes, kind of a risky move doing a blind moonsault when you have no way of judging where your opponent is. To which I said, you think? That's the fucking problem. Which is why that move is so goddamn stupid. It always is. It's phony. There's no possible way you could believably do a blind moonsault onto anybody without exposing the absurdity of it. Especially in the case of Andrade, where it takes him 20 seconds to get his balance straight. Meanwhile, Brody just has to stand out there on the floor waiting to catch him in his arms. Of course it's stupid. It's just as stupid when Adam Page does it. And I don't get Brody King at all, man. I mean, to me, he just comes off like another out-of-shape, tattooed indie guy that can do some okay athletic stuff, but his basics are the shits. I mean, nobody cared about this. I think after last week, everyone was sort of coming to expect the worst with all the blackout bullshit and all the spoopy lighting effects. I mean, it took until after the DQ finish to get that here, but even that was so lame. Like, Andrade's got Brody in the bridging figure 4. I guess that's an homage to his wife on the other channel because, I mean, Lord knows everyone in this company is always putting over how much better WWE is than their own product. So I guess that was just. And right before Brody's about to tap out, Buddy hits the ring and starts going to town on Andrade. And then the heels just beat up Andrade and leave him for dead. The angle is flatter than a plate full of piss. And then, of course, Malachi shows up on the big screen and they do the blackout effect, and that's that. Again, the shit doesn't belong here. You want to do all the hocus pocus Bray Wyatt lighting effect garbage? Fine. Do it on Rampage, where it won't offend the 150,000 people that are still watching that godforsaken show. Or, better yet, do it on Dynamite, where it would at least appeal to that kind of audience. Doing it on Collision is just a surefire way to run off the fans that are trying to give this product a second chance, especially when you're doing it 2 weeks in a row. And all to set up what in the end? I don't fucking know. Probably some kind of 6-man tag for the trios titles. If those are even a thing anymore, who even knows? When's the last time those belts were even mentioned on television, much less defended or even seen? And what, is Andrade just going to wind up going back with Jose the Assistant and Roosh and that other former job order reject? And the other masked fake luchador whose name I can't remember, he's so goddamn irrelevant. Great. Yeah. Sounds like the perfect usage for Andrade in his return. You stick him in another go-nowhere faction where everyone else gets swept up into on this roster, where no one can ever stand out on their own. Everybody's got to be in a faction. So I'm not liking where this is all going. So much for my optimism for the career resurgence of Andrade. Y'all wonder why I never give anyone credit in this business anymore. And from there, just back to the ring again for Tony Schiavone, wrestling's most useless interviewer. And now he's here to bring out Luchasaurus and Christian Cage, following last week's title change in the Wardlow match. And as expected, Christian's out there holding the TNT title over his shoulder, which is exactly what they needed to do. He's still playing up the gag that he's the actual champ, even though the dinosaur is technically the one that got the pin. And, of course, the dinosaur is not going to do anything about it. Their lizard brains are already microscopic to begin with. And, of course, they're in Toronto. So Christian spent half the promo bad-mouthing his hometown and calling out all the sports teams. It's cheap heat. I'm not a fan of it. I never have been. But that's just kind of what heels do because they know it'll generate a reaction. But he also had some housekeeping items to address now that there's been a turnover in the guard. As the new TNT champion, there will no longer be open challenges on TV. He made some snide remark about Cody Rhodes creating the TNT belt as a vanity project and how Christian won't be traveling that same path. That was a rather interesting pot shot. Although you look back in hindsight and realize, well, even if Cody did create the TNT belt as a vanity project, he's still probably by default the best TNT champion they ever had. Maybe a toss-up between him and Miro. At least he created some memorable moments with the belt, and he didn't just randomly hot potato it around to guys like we've seen them doing for the better part of the last year. Has that belt ever been any more worthless than it is right now? Just asking. But, it is a very interesting story in the sense that does Luchasaurus even register with the fact that Christian is just walking around carrying his title and barely even acknowledge him? Is he secretly okay with Christian pretending to be the actual champion? I like the premise of Christian acting so conceited and delusional that he actually believes he's the rightful champion. I'm just wondering if there's a shelf life to it that hasn't really been explored yet. Because, this story can get old very quickly if they're not careful. I mean, for now, I'm willing to see what they do with it. As for Wardlow, I mean, I don't really know if there's much left to salvage with that guy. I think old Yeller's ready to be taken out back and left for greener pastures. So after that was the point where they ran down the Owen Hart tournament participants, gave everybody an individual promo, and tried to hype the opening round matches. We'll cover the Punk Kojima match shortly because that was part of the Forbidden Door pay-per-view. There are, I believe it's 2 qualifying matches that are taking place next Saturday on Collision. You got Dustin versus Hobbs and Starks versus Juicy Fruit. I think I got that right. I mean, that's already 2 more matches on paper that are more enticing than virtually everything I got on this show outside the main event. You know, I talked about it on the Dynamite Report. The Owen Hart Foundation tournament has some potentially exciting things on paper. I like the guys involved. I like some of the options they could do as a result of the winners in each round. I like the fact that it's not entirely predictable who wins. That's kind of refreshing. I just wish they could have devoted the entire program to maybe building up all 8 of these guys individually with maybe some promos or some squashes. You know, instead of throwing out all the Forbidden Door garbage. I mean, we already had the main event 8-man tag with Punk, FTR, and Ricky versus Juice, Jay, and the Ass Boys, but maybe instead of Tanahashi and Strickland jacking off with air guitar spots for 10 minutes, maybe you could have booked a Roddy Strong squash or a Samoa Joe squash. Instead of the Brody King Andrade match that didn't do anybody any favors, they could have put a Punk promo in there. Maybe spend some time covering the Joe Punk history. Maybe you tie that in with a Dustin Rhodes match or something. I don't fucking know. Just eliminate the dreck and put some shit on the show that people might actually want to see. I don't know. Call me crazy. Or better yet, they could have cut the girls' match because see every comment I've ever made about an AEW women's match. The fact that it's death TV on every level and pretty much everybody recognizes that. Regardless of whether or not it's an Owen Hart tournament round. Because of course I forgot to mention that. Yeah, the girls are doing one of these tournaments too. Whatever. I mean, it's not even worth venting about at this point. I'd rather save my breath for things that are actually worth talking about. Willow Nightingale versus Nyla Rose. No one cared. Willow won. I'm more interested in seeing what they do with Scorpio Sky when he gets back in the ring. That promo he did was like one of the best things I've ever seen him do in AEW. And I'm not kidding. He was serious. He sounded authentic. He basically just reacquainted everyone with who he is, which is good. I mean, how long has it been since we've seen the guy on the show? I don't know where the hell he's been. But he talked about his career accomplishments in AEW. He said that he let his ego get the best of him. But now he's back. He's refocused. And now we're going to get to see the new and improved Scorpio Sky. Not the shadow of his former self. Not the guy hanging around in the background behind Ethan Page and Dan Lambert while Brandy Rhodes is out there cutting Spitfire promos on them. I dig. I like Scorpio. I don't have anything against the guy. I like the stuff he did with Chris Daniels and Kazarian way back in the Time Machine. You know, it was a gimmick without being excessively over the top and cringe. They had a shtick. The people liked it. Got over for a period of time. And they could wrestle, which helped a lot. I don't know what they plan on doing with him as a singles guy, but they have me interested. Again, it's somebody we haven't seen in a while. It's somebody that can go in the ring. Somebody that looks like he's taking his work seriously now, so I'm all on board. As long as I get the sense that guys are trying to go out there and be professional wrestlers, I'll humor them. I also like the Powerhouse Hobbs squash. even though it was short and concise. Sometimes that's the best policy, though, to getting a dude over. The problem with Hobbs' on and off, stop and start booking is that, and they've tried this exact experiment with him several times over, and it really never went anywhere beyond this. Like, y'all remember those random vignettes they were showing of Hobbs? Talking about his background, he was wandering through the streets, telling his life story. Wasn't there supposed to be a part 2 to that? And we just never got it? It's good to see the idea that they would take Hobbs seriously again. But here's the thing I'm worried about. Yeah, Hobbs is in the Owen Hart tournament. I would suspect that he goes over Dustin in the opening round. From there, I mean, if we're trying to apply rationality and logic to it, him and Ricky Starks had a feud going on at one point that was just sort of unceremoniously dropped. I vaguely recall both of those guys going over one another in that feud, and we never really got any kind of finality to it. So if it comes down to Starks versus Hobbs in the semi-round, I mean, you got to put Ricky over there if he's your front runner to win the tournament. So again, where does that leave Hobbs? After he loses to Starks, how do you keep that momentum going with him? Do you keep smashing him over job guys, or does he sit on the sidelines for another 5 months until Tony figures out what to do with him again? I mean, the QTV shit wasn't helping him any. We all remember how horribly that died a death. You know, the other option too, if you really want to keep Hobbs alive, and honestly, this might be the better option to go with now that I think of it, I'd maybe find a way to put Punk over Joe in the semifinal round so you can do Punk versus Hobbs in the finals. And maybe, if you really want to throw people for a loop, you have Joe cost Punk in the finals and put fucking Hobbs over. We all know how much Punk loved working with Hobbs when they did that TV match a year or so back. Punk had nothing but high praise for Hobbs and vice versa. They like working together. Why not, man? Have Joe fuck Punk over and have Hobbs win the Owen Hart tournament. It's probably not ideal for a heel to win a tournament dedicated to Owen, but I mean, that didn't stop them from putting over Britt Baker and Adam Cole last year when I'm pretty sure they were still both heel at the time. If you're trying to elevate somebody out of it, keep Hobbs undefeated for a while and build his credibility back up. Punk eating a loss and getting his win back on Joe later on isn't going to hurt him. You know, and then maybe later on you have Punk win the AEW title, and who knows? At some point next year you can find a way to do Punk versus Hobbs for the belt on pay-per-view and draw some fucking money. God forbid. Boom! I just booked your all-out main event for 2024, Tony. You're welcome. You should put me on the creative team. Oh, that's right. AEW doesn't have those. It's just a free-for-all, and everyone gets to do whatever they want with no handcuffs. Maybe I should get Moxley's input. See what he recommends. Anyway. At least I can say this. Next week's show looks a lot more promising on paper. Actually, looking at this now, we are apparently going to get all 3 opening round tournament matches next week. Ricky versus Juice, Dustin versus Hobbs, and Roddy versus Joe. All of which should be fantastic matches if they don't try to get too cute with the booking. You know, plus we got the in-ring debut of MJF, which I'm looking forward to as well. So, perhaps it's not looking all bleak in the land of Collision. Perhaps I jumped the gun there a little bit earlier on. Truth be told, I was just so aggravated with the first hour of the show, in particular because so much of it sucked. Due in large part to Chris Jericho. Hopefully that was an anomaly, though. But why don't we go ahead and talk about the main event? The 8-man tag. Rock Hard Juicy Fruit, Jay Switchblade White, and the Ass Boys versus Ricky Starks, FTR, and CM Punk. Or CMFTRs, I guess we're supposed to call them now. And boy, those Bret Hart comments really came full circle, didn't they? How do you filter out the haters from the fanatics? That's going to be the real battle outside those pro-punk crowds. Toronto. Man, oh man. It was a weird split for both nights, actually. On the Collision show, they were less hostile than I expected. But there were definitely some anti-punkers out there. And then the following nights, and it was a whole different story entirely. But even with the Collision show, like, there were enough pro-punk fans out there where it didn't really end up bearing the psychology of the match. Because it was a fabulous 8-man tag. Another case where everybody was out there firing on all cylinders. I'd even maybe argue this was just as good, if not a little better, than the 6-man last week. I think there was a little less hesitancy on Punk's part here, which was very promising. You know, last week he was definitely cutting back on the risk-taking and trying to modify everything he did as best he could. This week, he was a much more integral part of the overall story. I think everybody looked a lot more comfortable here, actually, especially in the case of FTR, Juice, and Jay. Now that they've had a chance to work together and kind of learn each other's movesets a lot better, they got rid of some of the kinks and they got a second going against each other, and a lot of their stuff looked fluid. But see, here's what I love about FTR's work in particular, and this kind of separates them from so many other people on this roster. Everything with them looks urgent. It always looks like a struggle with everything they do. Whether they're working offense or defense, there's no downtime with Dax or Cash. They're in, they're out, they hit their spots. None of it ever looks artificial. They don't take 15 minutes to set up high spots or double team moves. They always make sure everything they do looks authentic. You know, and going back to the Punk thing for a minute here, talking about how he was much more of a key element to the match this week. You know, whereas last week it was more about letting him dip his toes back into the water and hit some of his stuff without doing too much. This time, he was out there working as the underdog. He spent a good chunk of the heat portion letting the heels work him over. His selling was great. He fed well for everybody. I like that they weren't in a rush to let him get the hot tag at the end. You know, they stayed on everything and made sure they captured his facials. And I'll say this, man. People talk about the big feud being Punk versus Joe. I want to see him and Jay White work together in a singles program. I thought those two were doing some really nice stuff together here. The chop battle right before Punk's comeback was one of the best back and forths I've probably seen all year in AEW. I always complain about how contrived those back and forth exchanges look with most guys, where they're just standing there and cooperatively letting guys hit them. Not these two. They were laying it in. They were making it look like a battle. And I always knew Jay White was good. Haven't really seen much of that showcased in AEW because he's been such a non-entity on most of the Dynamite programs. And my God, Ricky's comeback. Holy shit, was that guy a house of fire. Talk about firing on all cylinders. That was the Ricky Morton comeback for the ages. You know, not only did they perfectly lean into it with that Punk tag, but Ricky going in there and cleaning house on all four guys. Again, yes, a lot of it was happening in rapid succession, but the idea is to make everything look urgent. You don't have time to mess around and do cute shit in these kinds of matches. You got too many bodies hanging around. If you're the babyface, you're looking for every opportunity to hit your spots and get the win. You know, and same with the heels, only they're looking for every opportunity to cheat, which I'll cover more when we get to the finish. The Cash spot. We have to talk about that for a second here. Little overzealous, but you know what? If you're going to do the cannonball dive out to the floor, Do it in style. I knew shit was about to take off when Cash got that extra speed coming off the ropes. I mean, he basically dived through the second ropes and did a full body rotation. It was very dodgy with how close he came to crashing into the barricade. I mean, thank God there were enough people there to catch him on the floor, but, yeah. Talk about throwing caution to the wind. It looked good, though. And like I said, I'm not the biggest fan of dives, mostly because everybody does them. But at least Cash's looked raw, instead of choreographed like everybody else's dives do a lot of the time, where they take like an hour to set it up like they're about to walk the trapeze rope at the circus. And yeah, it got a little chaotic at the finish there. A lot of stuff to keep track of. But I was okay with them doing the heat finish with Jay pinning Ricky. They had Juice punch Ricky through the second rope. Can't tell if he was supposed to have a gimmick in his hand or not, but, that set up Jay so he could hit the Blade Runner for the 3. Some could argue maybe a little early for Punk to be on the losing side of things. Yeah, I could see that. I probably would have reconsidered the finish. I mean, if Punk's team had to lose, then obviously you couldn't have him take the fall in it. But even a DQ finish with the babyfaces going over would have maybe been the better call. That way it's still a win for the faces, but, the heels can get their heat afterwards. It's semantics at the end of the day. But like I addressed at the top, another great match. This is probably the most motivated FTR have looked since the Briscoes program last year. Punk had a good showing. I'm glad he got more involved here and stuck his neck out a little bit more. He held his own very well. Ricky looked phenomenal. And the heels were good too. Everybody was great here. I really didn't have high expectations when Juice and Jay showed up. Took a while for me to get on board with them, but I think I'm sold. Again, they're working like pros. They're taking their stuff seriously. And as long as that's the case, I'm cool with them. Even the Guns look good here. Having them in these higher profile matches, that's the exact kind of exposure they need. If they're going to break out of their shell and learn how to become main event players, you got to pair them with the big boys. And again, they held their own. Obviously they're going to need to break away from this multi-man format eventually. I mean, you can't do these kinds of 6-mans and 8-mans every week. Elsewise, it's going to start to come off like every episode of Dynamite where we get nothing but these kinds of matches. But done in the right context with the right set of guys, with the ones that know how to structure and pace the matches, yeah, I'm okay with multi-man matches. As long as it looks like a tag match and isn't just guys doing a bunch of random shit with no roles, like, well, see the Elite BCC matches. They can work. The problem, again, as we'll discuss shortly with the Forbidden Door recap, it ends up turning into a lot of the BCC Elite formats most of the time. But here's what I'll say overall. The show, kind of all over the map. There was a great main event in the second hour, preceded by some decent material in the second hour to keep me captivated. So, the Owen Hart stuff, for example, the Powerhouse Hobbs squash. That stuff was good. But man, virtually everything I saw in hour one, that just all sucked a cock. It was like all of Tony's worst instincts hurled into a whole hour time frame. And then somehow in the last 30 or so minutes, they saved it. I don't know. I'm stumped here. I genuinely am. I'm happy to say that next week's card looks a lot more promising on paper. I'm stoked to see what MJF does. Tournament matches look enticing. Maybe you round that out with another Miro squash. That could be a well-rounded card right there. Not sure what Punk's going to do, but even a promo would suffice perfectly. We'll just go ahead and chalk up hour one to an abnormality. Again, I still want to give this show a chance before I completely, dismiss it and lose all hope. They threw a curveball at me this week. And there are still some caution signs that are waving at me. The caption for this program is, "Tell me when I'm telling lies." All right, Mr. Punk, I'll humor you for a minute. You usually come through with me, but I'm still not sold on this being the professional wrestling show quite yet. It's closer than Dynamite is, but hour one, that left me a little uneasy. All right, moving along here. Briefly, and while I would like to actually mean that this time, I can't guarantee it'll be brief. Not with the length this pay-per-view went on Sunday night. Jesus H. Christ on a cracker. AEW Forbidden Door. Yeah. You know, I said I was only going to talk about a handful of matches on this card. The ones that I actually thought were worth paying attention to. The ones that weren't just random video game-inspired New Japan versus AEW guys. So that basically eliminates like every multi-man tag on this fucking fiasco. Most of which I skipped anyway. I was getting some traumatic PTSD the hour or so before I actually sat down to order this thing on Sunday. And yes, I actually ordered the pay-per-view feed. Biggest regret I made in my life. But I couldn't find an illegal streaming service that would cooperate properly, so I figured while the pre-show was going on and most of those matches were completely skippable to begin with, I just said, fuck it, I'll pay for the thing. There'll be a lot of me walking and venturing in and out of the room throughout the night, but, at least I can still see the matches that I want to see and not have to wait until the next morning to find a download or something. But at least this year, knowing what this pay-per-view was headed into it, that being a Tony Khan vanity project, at least I can mentally prepare myself this time. And I'm going to start my review off by noting, you're not going to get a full pay-per-view recap from me. So I'm only here to review and critique the matches that I saw. It was still by and large at least 50% of the card, so it'll still be a thorough recap. But I can also admit that it's unfair for me to review the pay-per-view as a whole because, well, I didn't watch half the show anyway. So, don't expect me to give this an overall rating at the end. If you're somebody that was actually dumb enough to sit down and watch this entire thing from start to finish, God help your soul. I mean, your tolerance for severe punishment is way higher than my threshold is. There wasn't a 5-hour energy in the world that could get me to sit through this, 14, 15 match fiasco? Counting the pre-show material. Because I think by the end, the overall pay-per-view length was something like, 5.5 hours? Not that I'm surprised. I mean, we all know Tony Khan just doesn't sleep. If he's not up watching pro wrestling 24/7, he's on Twitter and Facebook causing havoc by trying to badmouth a bunch of wrestling journalists that actually call him out on his bullshit. Plus you had the media scrum afterwards because, of course, that was going to be a thing. Another 2 hours where Tony gets to sit there while everybody slobbers all over his jock and tells him how great he is. So with that said, we're going to get through this as swiftly and painlessly as possible. There were some highs and lows here, and they were all kind of muddled together throughout the show. Skipping over the pre-show because ain't nobody got time for that. We began the main card with MJF versus Hiroshi Tanahashi. The match that was set up on the go-home show of Collision, where MJF basically said, I told Tony Khan that I'm going on first because knowing this is already going to be a 5+ hour fap-off session for a bunch of indie marks, I'm going on first, I'm getting the match over with, and I'm getting the fuck out. So well played on MJF's part. I don't blame the guy. I'd want to get out of there as quickly as humanly possible myself. They call Tanahashi the ace, but MJF's the one that played the ace card here. Now, of course, and you're going to see a recurring theme play out with a lot of these matches I'm about to review, because the vast majority of these pay-per-view matches were basically advertised wet dream matches, you can't really judge the backstories because for a lot of them, there really weren't any. There was no storyline to this match. There was no rhyme or reason to care about it. In fact, the story, if you even want to call it that, was MJF basically going on TV and saying, this match idea is dumb, I don't want anything to do with it, and the only reason I'm humoring Tony Khan's fetishistic New Japan fantasies is that he's paying me a boatload of money to do it. And I get to go on first. Not really what you would call a grassroots traditional wrestling tale, but that's kind of where we are. In terms of what we got, is it easy enough to say MJF basically had a relatively good pay-per-view match with a wet sandbag? Because that's basically what I saw. I saw MJF trying to have a pro wrestling match with a guy in his mid-40s that couldn't keep up and was struggling to do basic things like even hitting the ropes. And while I've seen plenty of Tanahashi matches over the years, that was probably the one thing that stood out watching him compete in the G1 tournament a couple years ago. Health-wise, he's really not doing too well. You know, his body is clearly breaking down on him. And while I can maybe understand that was the motive to put him on the card with a guy like MJF, whose game is more built around milking big spots and working like a traditional heel, I can maybe understand them wanting to pair Tanahashi with him because they know the match will be slower pace and they can take their time with things. But even in this instance, man, Tanahashi was looking rough, man. I mean, it wasn't horrible. MJF knows how to get the most out of very little. He did all the usual heat spots, bailing out to the floor, trying to blow the match off, yelling at the fans for calling him a coward, cheap-shotting Tanahashi at every point he could. You know, he did the rope grab spot behind the ref's back while he had Tanahashi in the abdominal stretch. Like, clearly Max knows what he's doing in these kinds of circumstances. You know, I appreciated, too, that Tanahashi decided to leave the air guitar in the locker room this time, probably knowing MJF wasn't going to partake in that nonsense. The major drawback, though, was the spots where Tanahashi was trying to climb or hit the ropes. Because the problem, too, is that it winds up burying MJF when he has to wait for like 20 seconds for Tanahashi to get his balance right. Just so he can either catch Tanahashi off a dive or cut him off midway. Like the couple instances where Tanahashi was going for that high fly flow and he kept losing his footing on the top rope. At that point, I was like, Max, do something. Improvise. Even if the motherfucker is supposed to hit the spot, just do something else. Call it on the fly. This isn't working. And it's burying your credibility. So that was kind of aggravating. And then there was watching Tanahashi's comeback, which was equally as bad. I mean, I've watched YouTube videos at half speed that were working faster than Tanahashi. And even the finish to the match just kind of seemed out of the blue and very abrupt. So Tanahashi goes to hit MJF with a high fly flow, but MJF got the knees up. So they're both selling. Tanahashi the ribs and MJF the knees. And then Max rolls out to the floor so he can go to grab the triple B. So Bryce cuts him off to try and take that away. And then they do some convoluted scheme in the corner where Tanahashi has to turn his back to face Bryce. You know, obviously so MJF can shove him and temporarily blind the referee. And, I mean, it sort of worked. Tanahashi kind of grazed Bryce, but it didn't really look clean. And then Max just pulls out his diamond ring and hits Tanahashi 1, 2, 3. Kind of blech in terms of a finish, but there's really not much more I can add beyond that. I've had a lot of heavy criticisms about the way they booked MJF's title reign. I think this match will wind up falling into that same category when I look back down the road. I already don't like the stuff going on with him and Adam Cole right now. And this just kind of came off like a temporary distraction deal just to give MJF something to do on pay-per-view. I think they might have been better served with Max no-showing and getting slapped with a heavy fine. At least that would have fit the story with him not wanting to get himself involved with all the indie New Japan jagoffs. Like him actually being there with custom ring gear that read New Japan is indie and Tanahashi is mid. I think that's what his elbow pad said. I mean, all they did was kind of expose the fact that MJF was fine working the match. I mean, think about it. If he went out of his way to have custom ring gear made, it shows that he was going to show up to wrestle anyway. I mean, he'd have been better off coming out with a t-shirt and jeans. Maybe I'm overthinking it. I don't know. But I'll go ahead and grade this match on the MJF scale. It was mid. And from there, we went directly into another pay-per-view match that I was mildly interested in seeing. The first round of the Owen Hart Foundation tournament. It's Satoshi Kojima versus CM Punk, which I think when is all said and done, will primarily be remembered for the crowd reaction rather than anything that happened in the actual match. The Elite Fanatic Soy Boys were a lively bunch this particular evening, weren't they? Those poor unfortunate lost souls. A wise man once said, "Tell me when I'm telling lies." And boy, oh boy, couldn't be any more accurate when it comes to Punk's line about the Elite fans. "I'm sorry that the only people softer than you are the wrestlers you happen to like." Damn, what a pot shot. And damn if it ain't the God's honest truth. And you know what, Mem? Whether he's the whitest of white meat baby faces or a raging douchebag heel, he's still number one in my book. He can be the Andrew Tate of AEW. Whether you love him, whether you hate him, he knows how to generate and command attention in a room. If I'm being blunt, this is probably my favorite match on the card. While there were definitely elements to other matches that I probably liked more, this one as a general layout from start to finish was probably the most fluid. Yes, there's always going to be that proposition of maybe this wasn't the most ideal scenario for Punk's return in a singles match. I'd agree. Yeah, I'd probably gone a different route with the opponent, considering the fact that I don't think a lot of people really know all that much about Kojima, unless you were a big Japanese wrestling fan in like the early 2000s. You know, even for some of the AEW fans, it was a little before their time. But again, we're not judging this match by work rate. We're judging it by the way Punk carried himself. I mean, we knew the bizarro world he was backed into here. I mean, he wasn't going to get to turn the fans in his favor if he would have bought them all individual WWE ice cream bars. He was a heel, so he embraced it. But see, here's the genius thing about a guy like Punk. Yes, there were heel mannerisms that he used here, but he wasn't necessarily working like a traditional heel would. He certainly wasn't working the MJF style match. He wasn't going for eye gouging or low blows or looking for every opportunity in the book to cheat. Instead, he taunted the fans. He smirked and trash-talked a little bit. He was definitely more aggressive than what we would probably see in a regular babyface Punk match. But it wasn't over the top. And see, I like that a lot more. That's a dynamic that actually works for me. They're already going to have a hard time keeping Punk babyface in every city they go to, especially with the hostile nature of the AEW split crowd at this point. I mean, it's virtually impossible to do so. So if Punk is going to be heel to certain audiences, he doesn't need to automatically revert to cheating and cheap heat tactics like an MJF would. He just needs to be Phil Brooks. Snarky Phil, we'll call him. Let him do condescending promos. Let him taunt the fans. Let him kind of jerk people around and get under their skin. That's right up Punk's alley. He's great at doing that. He's been doing it on social media for the better part of the last 9 months. And it's worked. That's the great thing about it. And seeing him do all that in this match with Kojima gave me signs of hope. This match ended up being a lot more fun than I thought it would be. Punk was phenomenal. Kojima was good too. I don't want to take anything away from him. He held his own very well in there. The thing to keep in mind is both of these guys aren't young lions in the ring anymore, so they kind of worked it like a traditional old school hard-hitting Japanese match. A lot of chops, a lot of heavy strikes and kicks, but again, it looked like a struggle. And quite frankly, that's the kind of Japanese wrestling that I always prefer to watch. Not this modernized garbage where guys are chopping each other back and forth willingly, just standing there and taking it. Kind of like what I'll talk about with the Jungle Boy Sonata match shortly. And Punk going over with the GTS, obviously that's what needed to happen. I ended up enjoying this a lot more than I thought I would. And again, I think a lot of that stems from the way Punk conducted himself here. He knew the odds were stacked against him, and he cherished it. He embraced the hate. What a pro. Take it head on. And obviously this sets up him to go on to face the winner of Joe versus Roddy. That'll be interesting to see how they go about booking that. So far, though, we're 3 matches into Punk's return. 2 of them in multi-mans that have blown the roof off. Now this match with Kojima at Forbidden Door definitely exceeded my expectations. Perhaps that light at the end of the tunnel isn't as far out as I thought. So now comes the real qualm. We're 2 matches into this pay-per-view. So far, not bad. But your 2 opening back-to-back matches on the card were MJF and CM Punk matches in succession. Now, sure, it ain't a bad way to start a pay-per-view. The problem is, who the fuck else is supposed to follow it? Well, I'll tell you who was not a worthy contender. The 4-way international title sissy slap fight, featuring Tony's sponsor, the company mascot. This was the first point in the program where I was not even going to humor the idea of giving this a chance. I can contemplate giving a couple of the multi-man second looks. I can even consider watching Sonata's match with Jungle Boy. But I won't even spit in Orange Cassidy's general direction, much less watch one of his fucking matches. Forget it. So I got up to leave the room for about 15 minutes, and then I started hearing people sing Jungle Boy's theme song, so that's when I figured the coast was clear and I could re-enter the room again, now that the company mascot had vanquished. And speaking of Sonata and Jungle Boy, again, I said I probably wasn't going to watch this match. I had a change of heart. For one, I figured since I already had to pay for the fucking thing, I may as well just swallow my pride and suffer through it. And admittedly so, while I've really soured on Jungle Boy in the last year or so, I've seen Sonata have a couple good matches in New Japan. I remember him and Okada had a real banger in the G1 Climax a couple years ago. That was like one of my favorite tournament matches from what I remember. I don't really know if I buy the idea of him as the IWGP Heavyweight Champion. But when you look at the state of New Japan these days, what are your alternatives? It's either him or Okada for the 117th time. So anyway, the match. I'll say this. I didn't hate it, but a lot of it just screamed modern indie match to me. You know, and especially coming off the heels of the first two matches where you had MJF and Punk out there trying to work legitimate pro wrestling matches. I mean, this is like trying to follow a steak and potatoes lunch with a bologna sandwich for dinner. I know that's a stupid analogy, but I mean, I already know the kind of style that Jungle Boy works. Sonata, he's more of a hit and miss performer depending on who the opponent is. Generally, I would say they just try to get way too cute with the moves here. You know, by the time we get to the end and both guys are trading back and forth and no-selling everything, then at one point they're just hitting poison ranas back and forth and springing back up to their feet less than 5 seconds later. Like, that shit is ridiculous. And that was the point where I said, all right, I'm over it. I'm ready for the finish. You know, it all just basically descended into a modern video game match where everybody has endless energy and it's just way too ridiculous to buy any of it. And then we get the finish, which was just very weird. Well, at first when I saw it, I kind of figured that maybe Jungle Boy just blew the spot and forgot to kick out. But when I kind of go back and review the footage in my head, maybe the flat finish is what they were going for? The issue, I think, is that it was coming after they basically threw every move in the book at each other and did like 500 kickouts. And then from literally out of nowhere, Sonata just hits Jungle Boy with a moonsault press and pins him. And it wasn't even built up to. It was just like, boom, it's done. 1, 2, 3. So that was odd. But then when I saw the post-match angle on the ramp, maybe it was intentional. And I shouldn't really be all that surprised because I've been calling this as something they needed to do for a long time now. I guess I just wasn't expecting it to be done here. So, hey, props to them for swerving me. That was a genuinely good swerve because I never would have saw that coming. At least not done in this context. Now, for those that have no idea what I'm referring to, Jungle Boy and Hook are heading up the aisleway, and the announcers are getting ready to pitch everything to the next segment. And right as both guys are getting to the top of the ramp, Jungle Boy turns and decks Hook with a clothesline and lays him out. And that got a very big reaction from the crowd. I can even credit the announce team for trying to sell the genuine shock of the turn. I mean, by far the best worker in the whole exchange was Taz. Granted, I did think it was a little bizarre how he just sort of sat there and looked on while his own son was down selling and grabbing at the back of his neck. You know, Jungle Boy was just sort of hovering over him like he was about to do something else. I would have thought, like a father's first natural inclination is to do, Taz would have been the first guy to make a beeline up the aisleway to run Jungle Boy off. Bad neck or not. I mean, I'd have bought that Taz could have fucked his shit up. Especially with Jungle Boy being a weaselly little snake. But Taz was good selling everything on commentary. I was just a little curious as to why he didn't lift a finger to help his own son when he was laying 50 feet away from him at the top of the aisleway. You know, instead he's just sitting there going, "What the hell are you doing, Jack?" I don't know, Taz. Good question. How about you go grab him by his ratty hair and find out personally? With that said, goddamn, this has been like 8 months overdue. And you even saw the facials on Jungle Boy when he finally turned on Hook. And he's standing there mocking the fans and playing up the absurdity of the dancing and the waving of the arms for his theme music. I mean, that shit has always been stupid, but at least Jungle Boy's now embracing it. I mean, the first thing I wrote down here, the guy's going to be so much more natural on camera. When you factor in all those stories we've heard about Jungle Boy's attitude backstage in this company, the fact that he's generally an unlikable person because he's such a whiny, petulant douchebag. You know, when I saw him standing there scowling, I bought it. I was like, yeah, he does kind of look like a miserable prick. And he's been dying on the vine as a babyface for so long now. You want to talk about going against the grain. It was only a matter of time before they needed to go there with the heel turn. They've been putting it off forever, so I'm not opposed to it being done here. Now we just need to see him fully embrace the persona on camera. Jack Perry unfiltered. Let the fucking guy shoot. Let him talk about how much he hates the locker room and hates being told what to do. It'll probably be the most personality the guy's ever shown on camera. Let's see what the measly prick's got. At this point, how much could it harm his career? Lord knows the babyface run wasn't killing him. So I'll give it a thumbs up. The match was kind of shitty, but I like the heel swerve. Well done. They got me hooked at the end. Ah, see what I did there? They got me hooked. Ba-don't. All right, I'll shut up. So at this point, we're back to the calling cast of empty-headed indie dipshits. We follow that with the 10-man Elite BCC Slobberfest. And I don't think I need to sit here and go over the logistics of why I actively boycotted this match like the plague. See the parties involved, for one. I also kind of figured they were going to give this match time. And boy howdy, they didn't disappoint. 20 plus minutes of this nonstop chaos and bullshit. For the several times that I walked in and out of the room. That's all I saw. Guys doing spots in the ring, guys doing spots out of the ring, people coming in and out without tags. No sense of logic, rules, or coherency to anything going on. I mean, you all know the drill when it comes to elite matches. That's not anything new. We've been seeing it for the better part of the last decade, if you've ever watched any of their stuff on the indie circuit. It's the PWG mentality brought to mainstream television. And it's sucked for the better part of 4 years, despite what Meltzer Magoo might try to tell you otherwise. You know, the Elite going over at the end wasn't all that shocking. She getting the pin was fucking stupid. Of all the guys to let get the pin in this match, you went with the New Japan guy that we're not going to see on this show for another year. I mean, if anybody needed to get the pin in this match, it was probably Kingston, since he literally just came back. You know, but then again, when I look at the state of him, maybe not. My God, Eddie Kingston. What the fuck? I'm not entirely convinced he isn't carrying half the AEW roster inside that fucking overbloated beer gut he's rocking. I mean, it's one thing to have a little bit of a belly. I mean, Dusty Rhodes wasn't Hercules Hernandez in terms of a physique. But Eddie Kingston, am I exaggerating, or is he probably in the worst physical shape he's ever been in? He's never had a body, you know, but he at least had a little bit of bulk in terms of his arms and shoulders to sort of mask that. Since he's been off of TV, I don't know what his eating habits have been like, but it's involved a lot of it. And then some. I mean, it's borderline unprofessional level bad. I'd even argue unhealthy bad. You know, people don't like having these kinds of conversations because the whole body shaming thing is already a controversial topic to begin with, especially in the culture we live in today. But objectively speaking here, there's going to come a point where Tony's going to need to have an honest conversation with a lot of his locker room about this, because I'm seeing a lot of guys in AEW right now that are just out of control with letting their bodies go. Now, some of them are going in polar opposite directions. In the case of Eddie, it's eating too much. In the case of guys like Adam Cole, it's eating one meal every 6 weeks to the point where it just looks sickly gaunt. But this is a real issue right now. Guys are not taking their bodies seriously. If I took the time to actually run down AEW's roster, I can probably find at least 20 to 30 guys that Tony ought to be sitting down with and having a discussion about their workout regimens. Throw Chucky Fucky Finster into that equation as well. Or that job order guy with a shark mask. I always forget his name. Evil Uno. I mean, that guy's always looked rotten physically. Brody King, I'd probably throw into that equation as well. It's just embarrassing. You're on national cable television. There needs to be a certain degree of professionalism when it comes to your on-screen look. Especially with the body. And look, I get it. Not everyone is going to look like Rick Rude or the fucking Legion of Doom. But when I see guys on this show that look like they've never even smelled the inside of a gym before, that's a problem. It's a big problem. And Eddie Kingston is just another added wrinkle. So anyway, that's my review of that match. 21 minutes. And it was all the usual BCC elite garbage. I mean, I know what I'm getting, so I'm not really going to dwell on it because it's not even worth talking about. It's another prime example of, for the kind of people that like that kind of thing, that's the kind of thing those people like. And there's always going to be an audience for it. It's a very minimal audience, but hey, if they're okay appealing to that market, good for them. So at this point in the show, I kind of checked out mentally for a while. You know, the 10-man tag was nothing but nonstop video game moves and glorified parkour. I already knew that was going to be the case before I even sat down to watch it. Well, I didn't watch it, but when I saw the graphic flash up for it. And then following it with a girls' match, Willow Nightingale versus Toni Storm. I was still trying to collect my thoughts and mentally stay alive for all the other horse crap that was yet to come. And then we came to the Will Ospreay-Kenny Omega match. And you're probably all sitting there wondering to yourself, oh, there's no way. He actually watched this? Well, in fact, yes. Yes, I did. And I truthfully thought that I was going to regret every last minute of it, as it was stricken from my livelihood. And I watched it. By the time it was over, I'm honestly still not sure what I thought of it. This was goddamn bizarre. Some would call it a spectacle. I say it was one of the most bipolar matches I've ever seen in AEW. I'm not even entirely sure how I can even break this match down because, I mean, there's so much to unpack here. Let me start here. There were so many things to like about this match. Things that actually kind of got me to remember that, hey, you know, whenever Omega willingly decides to disassociate himself from all the nonsense involving the Beta Bucks' trampoline backflips, Kenny Omega can actually have really good wrestling matches. The problem is we see it so rarely in the context of what he does on AEW, you kind of forget the guy's capable of actually doing them. Because we don't see it that often. I'm old enough to remember that hour Broadway he had with Bryan Danielson on Dynamite a little over a year ago. That tore the house down. I mean, it was easily one of my favorite Kenny Omega matches I've ever seen. I'd put that over any of those overrated Okada matches in New Japan that Meltzer boasted about years ago. And like I said, it's so goddamn frustrating. Because I watch a match like this, and I know Omega is fully capable of having these kinds of good matches whenever he decides to work like a grown adult professional. If we got more Omega matches like this on Dynamite, instead of the Rancho Cucamonga cockfights we normally get with him and the Bucks of fuckery, I'd be more prone to give the guy the benefit of the doubt. But he just can't see past the smell of his own wet farts a lot of the time. It's hard to defend him. Especially with the kind of rat pack he hangs out with. I mean, this was about as close to a 5-star Omega match as you're probably ever going to get. Which means that Dave will give it something like 8.5 stars. Actually, I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. More accurately speaking, for about the first 30 minutes, this was the best Kenny Omega match I had ever seen. And then there was the point from basically 30 minutes onward. And, well, they jumped the shark. And I was quickly reminded that I'm still watching a Kenny Omega match, so it's never going to be perfect. You know, there are always going to be certain things that bother me about modern wrestling matches. I'll never like the spots where the guys let each other chop one another back and forth. I hate it. You know, I'll never be a fan of the Hulk up and hit like 50 moves in a row, completely no-selling and negating everything that happened like 5 minutes prior. That shit is always going to suck. But I can overlook a lot of that stuff if I get the general sense that the guys competing in the match look like they're trying to actually work a legit fight. Which again, is why this match was so frustrating to watch. For 30-something minutes, it was the closest thing I've ever seen to a perfect Kenny Omega match. At least when it comes to pro wrestling aspect of things. Now, I should point out, yes, they aired a promo package before the match. No, I did not watch their match from Wrestle Kingdom this year. It just wasn't in the cards for me at the time. So I didn't really have any knowledge of their feud prior to this, except for, I guess, Omega beat Ospreay for the IWGP US title back in January, so this was match 2 in the series or something. That's basically the extent of what I knew about it. I talked about Omega. I know what he's capable of doing in singles action whenever he decides to play it serious. With Ospreay, he's another guy that I've run hot and cold with over the years. Some of his matches in New Japan I've thoroughly enjoyed. Others, I think he gets swept too much into the modern indie style where he relies on the aerial dives and the video game moves to carry a lot of the work. Which again is kind of upsetting because when I was watching some of his facials in this match with Omega, the one thing I kept thinking to myself was, man, if that guy was a few inches taller and maybe like 15 pounds heavier, he could be one of the most believable top heels in AEW. Like I said, there was so much to like about this match. The mat wrestling at the beginning was outstanding. You know, they're taking their time, jockeying for position, trying to feel each other out. They're not rushing into anything from the gate. They build to the angle early on where Don Callis tries to grab at Kenny's ankle, and those guys have an altercation on the floor until Paul Turner sends Donnie dipshit to the back, which is good. Yes, it's exactly what needed to happen. Get him out of there. It eliminates all the distractions. You know, you do the manager spot early on, get it out of the way. It's what needed to happen. You didn't need Callis' involvement. And for a while, you got Ospreay working over Omega. They did a great juice spot with Omega on the floor where Ospreay kept throwing him face first into the announce desk. And Omega wasn't putting his hands up to protect him. He was taking those shots. They were definitely worked, but I mean, it looked kind of dodgy. I mean, the camera was right there to film it too. It looked really brutal. So, of course, you got Omega bleeding, and he's doing a really fine job selling. It's another hidden element to Omega's work that we don't see that often. The guy can actually sell. The guy's got facials. Sometimes a little too overdramatic, but I mean, at least he has some. But especially at the later point in the match where Omega's bleeding everywhere, he's staggering around on his feet, throwing the stammering punches. That was like one of my favorite parts of the whole match. You know, Ospreay's in there laying in the offense, Omega's selling the exhaustion. Again, it looked like two guys in a real legit fight. It wasn't a backyard trampoline match where they're doing flips and high spots for 20 minutes. It looked like something you could actually see in territorial footage. Maybe a big title match, main event in Crockett Promotions in the mid-'80s. It had those elements. You know, and even when Ospreay got juice later on, the blade job, that was even better than Omega's. At least I thought. And with the way Ospreay sold everything facially, it was an even better visual. Yeah, I didn't really mention the heat spots with Ospreay and the Canadian flag. You know, wiping his crotch with it and flipping off the fans. I was more or less okay with that. You know, it got a good heat reaction. And it was kind of funny seeing Ospreay stand there on the apron rubbing the flag between his crotch. You know, and Omega got the babyface pop when he laid out Ospreay and handed the Canadian flag to a couple kids in the front row. I think in counting, that comprises of all of Kenny Omega's fans under the age of 7. Anyway. So we're rapidly approaching the half-hour mark. I kind of figured they were going to give it a lot of time, and frankly, if they had shaved off everything that happened after the 30-minute mark in this match, I would easily chalk this up to AEW's match of the year. Or at least one of the better ones. And then the overbooking happened. Here comes Don Callis. And my immediate first note reads, fuck. Because I knew what was coming. So they end up doing a spot. Oh, by the way, I should mention, Don Callis, yeah, he just meandered back out again. Nobody came out to stop him. No one came out to eject him again. He just walked back down to ringside, willy-nilly. And while Omega has Ospreay set up for the V-trigger in the ropes, Don climbs up to the ring apron and tries to cover up Ospreay. My first instinct was to scream, DQ! But then I remembered AEW doesn't really do those unless it suits the narrative. So Omega hits Ospreay with the V-trigger anyway. And as he goes to pull him into the ring, Don grabs Ospreay in plain view of the official. And then he and Omega proceed to start having a tug of war over Ospreay's dead body. Again, I wrote, D-fucking-Q. Nope, the match continues. Paul Turner's just standing there watching like a total dipshit. Finally, he decides to get in the middle of it by trying to separate Callis. At which point, Callis begins to fish around in his pocket for the screwdriver. And he's fishing. And he's fishing. Time passes. He's attempting to pull the gimmick out. It's clear as day that the thing is stuck on his fucking coat pocket. He's got one hand in the pocket. The other hand, I think he has on Ospreay's head. So, finally, he's able to pull the gimmick out. And he hands it to Ospreay, which was the intended plan. It just looked ridiculous because the botched spot took like 30 seconds to set up. It buried everybody involved. And then Ospreay, of course, hits Omega with a screwdriver. followed by a Stormbreaker for a 2 count. Because of fucking course it was. Of course it was only going to be a 2 count. Because we had to fit in more shit, you see. At which point the entire match just went off the rails. It's at this point where both guys began to then fire up on each other and hit like 47,000 moves in a row. Back and forth, finisher after finisher, counter after counter, no sell after no sell. At the point in the match where you would think both guys should be on the brink of passing out. No, of course, this is where they're the most fired up. During the sequence, Ospreay hit Omega with the one-winged angel for a kick-out at 1. And that's when I threw up my hands and said, fuck it, I'm done. Thankfully, the finish came a couple minutes later when Ospreay finally hit Omega with a Stormbreaker and pinned him. Which was still preceded by about 50 other moves, but what can you do? God damn, this was so infuriating. It really was, man. They almost had it. They were that close. That close to being a perfect, phenomenal match. And from the point they try to get too cute with the Don Callis shit, on top of them breaking into a slew of video game moves and kicking out of everything for the next 10 minutes, they lost me. If they would have cut the screwdriver spot and all the back and forth nonstop kickouts and no-sells that followed, this was hands down in the realm of discussion for AEW's top match of the year. Certainly in the top 3. But they just couldn't help themselves. They let these guys go out there unfiltered. And it blew up in their faces. And again, it's frustrating because I really wanted to like this match. And for about the first half hour, I did. But they just kept going, and the overbooking started, and they just kind of petered out at the end. Turned into every modern main event match these days, and guys just not knowing how to filter it. It just breaks down into big move, kick out, big move, kick out, big move, kick out. And again, I know that's what wrestling fans are trained to react to, but they didn't need to go there. They could have built this match entirely differently, and it would have been perfectly fine. You know, the problem here with Ospreay and Omega is that they don't need the bullshit. They proved that they could work just by having a regular standard professional wrestling match. You know, even if they would have cut it at the screwdriver spot, sure, it still would have sucked. But at least you could have avoided all the shit afterwards that just dragged everything down and destroyed all believability. You know, especially when you're going to have Ospreay go over anyway. Why did you need to do all this stuff after the screwdriver? I don't know. They didn't really need to. It was a tale of two matches. You had the beginning stages where everything made sense and looked great, and then you had unfiltered Kenny Omega in the last 10 minutes, and it just kind of ruined it. So I'll leave you to be the judge of this one. There were a lot of things to like about this match, but goddamn those last 10 minutes. Fuck those last 10 minutes. So by now, we basically had 2 matches left to go. The 6-man tag with Jericho, Guevara, and Suzuki versus Sting, Darby, and Naito. That was my designated palate cleanser. And after seeing everything transpire in the previous match, I was not ready to subject myself to a Chris Jericho match on this card. I already talked about the Naito stuff in the Collision Report. If you already know the backstory with him and Jericho, cool. This is probably the match for you. But I did still want to see the main event with Okada and Danielson, and I was already irritable and ready to fall asleep by this point, so I pieced out on this match as well. And then finally, mercifully, we arrive at the main event. And it couldn't have come at a better time. Right at the point my brain had completely melted into a liquid puddle and was just sprawled out all over my living room floor. Closing in on the 11:30 Eastern Time, by my watch, we get the main event. Kazuchika Okada versus Bryan Danielson. And beyond the fact that this was a first-time encounter between both guys, I think I was more so interested in seeing this match for the pure nostalgia factor of actually getting to see the American Dragon again. Not the AEW version of Bryan Danielson where he's in the background playing with the BCC and doing all that horse shit. The actual pro wrestler Bryan Danielson. That's when he shines the best. When that Danielson decides to show up to work, it's like a whole different personality. And you even see it facially when he's out there. He just looks so much more motivated. When it comes to Okada, you've probably heard my opinions on him. He can do some great stuff, but there's a burnout factor with him that's really hindered my enjoyment of his matches in recent years. There's a reason I call him New Japan's John Cena. And when you see the same guy getting pounded and rammed down your throat as a top guy with very little involvement in the main event picture, and everything ends up revolving back around that same guy over and over again, you start to get a little fed up with it after a while. The other thing when it comes to Okada is that his matches are also very hit and miss for me. Sometimes they hit home. Other times, I think they're boring as shit. And I think a lot of that has to do with the opponent. I'm not a fan of the Rainmaker finish, especially when it takes him 17 attempts to actually pin the guy with the move. But I will say, on general principle, despite any of the flaws that I had going into this, there was an excitement level to this on paper. Yes, it's a first time ever pairing. It's arguably two of the best wrestlers in the world facing off. Two top guys on each opposing company's roster. So, it definitely had a main event feel to it. So, what did I think? Well, it was late, for one. I wasn't the most enthused or awake by this point. Some of that might have hurt my overall enjoyment. I would say it was good. Maybe just good. Again, you have to understand, this is a long-ass fucking show. And I already had seen all the stuff prior with Ospreay and Omega where they basically threw everything but the kitchen sink at each other. Sometimes the other issue is, how do you follow the car wreck sighting with the guy that backs into the telephone pole? The car wreck is more exciting because there's more shit happening. The guy that backs into the telephone pole, I mean, he catches your attention momentarily, but then you see it and you're like, all right, now what? I mean, what these guys did was fine. It was a very different match than the Omega Ospreay one, for sure. It came off like a standard New Japan main event match. A lot of it was back and forth, and that's fine if the idea is that both guys are on equal playing fields of skill and ability. They try to keep it interesting with certain angles and spots. The tombstone spot on the ramp comes to mind because they had Danielson pretend to convulse in the ring at one point, and that allowed for him to kind of lull Okada so he could take advantage. He definitely gave off the impression that we were getting a totally different Bryan Danielson. I don't really know if he was necessarily being heel or not. He was more gritty and hard-hitting, which is always the more preferable Bryan Danielson. I think the finish is what shocked people the most. Like Danielson going over Okada with the tap out. That was surprisingly good. The announcers definitely sold it like it was a big deal. Okada losing is always kind of seen as a major upset, so I imagine the tap out was what kind of shocked people even more. And it sets up some interesting scenarios down the road should they ever decide to revisit this program. I don't know if it was designed to be a one and done, but honestly, my hope is that the next time they do this match, it doesn't happen 5+ hours into a fucking pay-per-view when I'm already tired and cranky to begin with. Because there were large portions of this match where, I'm going to be honest, man, I was starting to nod and drift asleep. It really kind of lost me at one point. Not for any lack of effort on their part. I mean, they were having a good match, but it was just, I was exhausted. And that's probably why I can't really grade the match above a certain level. It was good. But because of where it happened on the card, I was just kind of over the pay-per-view. I was just ready for the whole thing to be over by the time they rang the bell to start it. I know that's not really a thorough review of the match, but them's the breaks. That's probably going to be the disappointing feature when it comes to these never-ending Tony Khan wet dream projects. It's a prime example of just because he can stay awake for 7.5 hours for these marathons doesn't mean everybody else can. I mean, we already knew how long this was going to go just by looking at the card on paper. And it's always the same song and dance. These pay-per-views are way too fucking long. And if they'd have cut like half the card and focused on the big marquee matches that actually mattered, probably would have been a whole lot better. But the issue for Tony is that he's not focused on that. He wants to get as many people on the card as he can. And it usually ends up hurting the overall grading of the shows because you're left totally exhausted and irritable by the time it's over. Now, I'm lucky enough to where I didn't have anything going on the following day. Otherwise, I don't think I would have had a chance to record the Forbidden Door recap until like well into Tuesday night. These shows, it's the same problem with virtually every AEW event. Everything is way too long. They try to cram in too much on the show, and it's just overbearing. Now, the matches that I saw, the ones that I wanted to check out, for the most part, I had a lot of good things to say about them. But it's not really fair for me to grade the show as a whole because I just didn't have the time or energy to want to bother watching the whole goddamn thing. From what I did see, there were a lot of things to like. There were a lot of things to hate. It was a mixed bag, as I kind of expected it would be. But this is the recurring story with AEW. It's always been that. There are going to be things that I like, things that I don't like, and it's really just a grab bag of trying to find the good stuff where it lies. You know, Punk being back in the equation is a hopeful sign, but they still got a lot of issues as a company right now that they need to address. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news for Mr. Khan here, but those problems that you've got going on right now, those aren't going to be solved by doing a bunch of New Japan versus AEW wet dream matches. They'll definitely sidetrack the problems, but you're eventually going to have to address them at some point, Tony. Just saying. You got a Wembley Stadium show to sell this summer. Maybe you start trying to rectify some of the ongoing backstage problems that have been overseeing your company for the better part of the last 9 months. Just some food for thought, brother. But, god damn, this is a long show. I knew it would be. I knew it would be. Alright. So, folks, thanks for checking this one out. I got a lot of editing to do, so I'm not even going to do much with the outros here. We're just going to peace out and try to get back on Friday to the regular Friday format. Still going to keep going with the Dynamite reports. Obviously, we got the Retro Review series coming up too, so stay posted for that. Chime in with your thoughts on everything we talked about today. Feel free. And we'll catch you all on the flip side. Peace out.